I'd like to take this moment to talk about a key player of the Disney Renaissance. One of the top people accredited to save Disney animation when they were at their lowest point, and even saving the entire company by bringing on board Michael Eisner and Frank Wells as their leaders. I am of course talking about Roy E. Disney, the son of Roy O. Disney, and the nephew of Walt Disney. Throughout the late 1980s and 1990s, as chairman of Disney's animation department, Roy always knew that animation is the backbone of the Walt Disney Company, and did everything he could to make sure that every animated film he helped out on turned out to be the best they could be. And judging by how things were going during Disney's Renaissance, I think it's safe to say that he did his job very well. However, throughout the 1990s, Roy also was working on a passion project, something that he always wanted to do for many years that would bring back one of Disney's classics. Maybe not a sequel per se, but rather a continuation of the legacy of one of Walt's most ambitious works. In short, Roy's big project was to make another Fantasia. To quickly recap what I said before, the original plan for Fantasia was to be continuously re-released in theaters, but for each time, Disney would include a new segment to make each release a different experience. However, due to the film initially getting a mixed reception from both critics and audiences, and bombing at the box office, largely due to expensive equipment that was needed to fully present the film at the time, the plan was ultimately scrapped. It wouldn't be until several decades later when the idea of another Fantasia emerged at the studio with a project called Musicana. Developed by Mel Shaw and Woolie Reitherman in the late 1970s, it was a spiritual successor to Fantasia that would have the same format of the feature, but presented stories and music from all around the world. Unfortunately, the studio didn't feel ready at the time to make another Fantasia-style film, and the project was thrown out in favor of making Mickey's Christmas Carol. A few years later, after Roy brought Michael Eisner and Frank Wells to be the CEO and the president of the company respectively, he suggested to Eisner an idea to make another Fantasia. At first, the heads at Disney were a little hesitant. Some didn't care much for it, others were open to the option, but also had a hard time finding a composer. It wasn't until the early 1990s when the original Fantasia had a bit of a mainstream comeback. The 1990 re-release was a hit by earning $25 million at the domestic box office, and a year later, it became one of the best-selling VHSs with over 14 million copies sold. For the first time, the company saw the potential of expanding Fantasia and how it can be commercially viable thanks to the newfound interest in the classic Disney film. And so in 1991, Eisner greenlit the project titled Fantasia Continued and put Roy in charge as an executive producer, using the earnings from the Fantasia VHSs to fund the film. Disney also brought in Donald W. Ernst to help him out as producer, and Rescuers Down Under director Hendel Batoy as the movie's supervising director. The first order of business for the new crew was to find the right conductor for the project, since the first Fantasia was a collaboration between Walt Disney and Leopold Stokowski, so they couldn't just grab any conductor. They needed someone who had the same legendary status as Stokowski and open to manipulate classical pieces of music for the feature. Their search led them at the Metropolitan Opera in New York City, where its conductor, James Levine, was enthusiastic to join the team, and throughout production, he was said to be like a kid in a candy store with all the potential music he could play with. Roy also wanted to have the interstitials, like in the first film, to be like a palate cleanser after every segment. While he got Don Hahn to direct them, they had a hard time figuring out who would be the new master of ceremonies like Deems Taylor was before. Ultimately, the studio decided to go with not one, but several celebrities, including, in the order of their appearance, Steve Martin, Itzhak Perlman, Quincy Jones, Bette Midler, James Earl Jones, Penn and Teller, James Levine with Mickey Mouse, and Angela Lansbury. Originally, to keep the spirit of Walt's original vision for Fantasia alive, Roy wanted to include half of the original film and put in about 3 to 4 new segments. Realizing that the idea sounded better in his head than out loud, he cut the old parts down to just 3 with The Sorcerer's Apprentice, The Nutcracker Suite, and Dance of the Hours. But by time, even that did not last long. Dance of the Hours was eventually scrapped, and The Nutcracker Suite ended up getting replaced by a new segment, leaving The Sorcerer's Apprentice as the only segment from the predecessor to remain as an homage to Walt's idea of an ever-evolving concert feature. So with all that said, and the movie itself got the orchestra ready, let's start the music and get into the segments. The first piece of the feature is Symphony No. 5 by Ludwig van Beethoven. Similarly to the toccata and fugue number in the first, it is more of an abstract segment that presents colors, shapes, and lights, but this time, it also features a narrative of the battle of light and darkness with colorful butterflies and black bats. The choice for this piece was because of the familiarity, as the first 4 notes are the most famous composition in all of classical music. This is also why it's the first segment to immediately give audiences something they already know to make it easier for them to get into the movie right off the bat. For 2 years, starting in 1997, director Peixoto Hunt used his time to figure out which parts of the music that should feature either more of the vibrant colors or the dark tones, along with blending the handcrafted work of the animators with CGI and caps. The artist started with the pastel backgrounds and hand-drawn character animation for the shapes that had more personality, and the computers later added the effects, the giant horde of the good and evil shapes, and for the CG models to recreate the movements done in hand-drawn. Next up is Pines of Rome by Ottorino Respighi, which presents humpback whales flying in the sky. Why flying whales?
Why not flying whales?
This was the first piece the team selected to be a part of the feature back in 1993. They didn't really know what to do at first, but from the sound of the music, they knew that flying would be an essential theme. When one artist was doodling clouds during a meeting, Hendel Batoy noticed that one of them was shaped like a whale, and the idea of flying whales stuck ever since. At the time, computer graphic imagery was a brand new piece of technology that Disney still had a lot to learn how to properly use it, but they knew that they needed it to make the part. The whales started out as traditionally animated, but their weight and movement didn't feel believable enough and resorted to animating them with CGI, even using the same systems for the wildebeests in The Lion King so that the pod of whales don't end up randomly bumping into each other when they all appear. However, they also quickly learned that even early computer animation had its limits, which was why the eyes had to be hand-drawn to give the whales a better look. Then comes Rhapsody in Blue by George Gershwin that shows 4 people in 1930s New York City who wanted a better life for themselves and get their wish through their adventures that coincidentally connect with each other. Originally, it was intended to be its own short after Eric Goldberg and his wife Susan, straight out of Aladdin, wanted to make a cartoon set to Gershwin's music presented in the style of Aladdin's artistic inspiration, Al Hirschfeld, which Hirschfeld himself agreed to collaborate as an animation consultant. After having a storyboard screening with some of the Disney heads, Roy was so impressed with it that he knew the short had to be in the movie, and switched the old Nutcracker segment with Rhapsody. That, and they were coincidentally looking for a piece made by an American composer, so it was a perfect fit for the next Fantasia. As it is also a tribute to the works of Hirschfeld, the Goldbergs added in a wide variety of Easter eggs throughout the piece that ranged from nods to the team making the film, including the Goldbergs themselves, and one of the characters was modeled after animation historian John Culhane, cameos of caricatures done by Hirschfeld like one of Gershwin himself, and even having Hirschfeld's signature mark of sneaking in his daughter's name Nina into each of his work. Also, with the exception of The Sorcerer's Apprentice, this is the only segment not conducted by Levine at the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. Instead, it was done by Bruce Brodin with the Philharmonia Orchestra. Levine later conducted the piece for the film's soundtrack. After that, it's Piano Concerto No. 2, Allegro Opus 102 by Dmitri Shostakovich that tells the story of The Steadfast Tin Soldier by Hans Christian Andersen, where a broken toy soldier has to save a toy ballerina that he's in love with from an evil Jack-in-the-Box. Originally, all the way back in the 1930s, Walt Disney wanted to make an animated adaptation of the story as part of the scrap collaboration with MGM to make a Hans Christian Andersen biopic, the same project where Disney first tried to animate The Little Mermaid. After Roy thought about having Piano Concerto No. 2 in the picture, Batory discovered that the Tin Soldier story was a perfect fit for the music thanks to a 1991 Disney book that told the story with images of artwork made for the canceled project. While the soldier and the ballerina stayed mostly true to the original designs back in the 1930s, the Jack-in-the-Box went through numerous of changes in order to make him easier to animate. As it was one of the first segments in production, this was also one of the first projects at Disney that featured the main characters entirely animated in CGI. In fact, Disney was making computer-animated living toys before Pixar released Toy Story. Speaking of Pixar, they were supposed to produce the animation for the segment, but the studio told them that they were confident that Disney could do it on their own. The ending was supposed to stay more true to the source material, where the soldier and the ballerina melted in the fire, but they had to make it a happier ending, not really because it's Disney, but the music itself ended on a more upbeat note, and they had to change the narrative to fit the piece. Next up is Carnival of the Animals Finale by Camille Saint-Saëns that features a flamingo that rather wants to play with his yo-yo instead of following the others. The idea first came when Disney veteran Joe Grant thought about a sequel to the original Dance of the Hour segment, where one of the ostriches was given a yo-yo. While most of the concept stayed, the ostriches were turned into flamingos to both avoid the familiarity of its predecessor and give the segment more color. Just like Rhapsody in Blue, the segment was led by Eric and Susan Goldberg, who aimed for a quick comedic moment for the picture, inspired by Eric's directing partner in Pocahontas, Mike Gabriel, who often played with his yo-yo during his break. Following The Sorcerer's Apprentice after Carnival is Pomp and Circumstances, Marches 1, 2, 3, and 4 by Edward Elgar, which tells the story of Donald Duck as Noah's assistant when bringing all the animals into the Ark, and momentarily thought that he lost Daisy along the way. The one who first thought about the piece was actually not from any of the filmmaking team, but rather, it was Michael Eisner, who got the idea after attending his son's graduation, since the piece is known by many as a staple for those ceremonies. As for what would be represented visually, Eisner thought about presenting a large wedding featuring all the Disney princesses with their lovers, each carrying their future children as they say their I do's. For the animators, this was absolutely horrifying. Because not only would it look like the characters were a part of some freaky religious cult ritual, but also, if Disney presented all the princesses pregnant next to their true loves, then it would lead the audience to think about the process of how they were, how can I put this? Getting knocked up.
We did more than just kiss. It's clear he didn't miss.
Also, just a reminder, most of the Disney princesses are below the age of 18.
Ultimately, Michael agreed to scrap it, but still really wanted them to use the piece.
Oh my! Ariel? Yeah, it's too late from our end, unfortunately. Coming soon to own on video and Disney DVD. Good luck with this one, parents.
It took a while for the animation team to think of a story that would fit the music, but director Francis Glebus eventually came up with Noah having a hard time to get all the animals in the Ark. Later on, Glebus added Donald Duck to be Noah's assistant with an extra narrative of trying to find Daisy. And finally, to conclude the picture, it's the Firebird Suite 1919 version by Igor Stravinsky, where a tree nymph-like sprite accidentally awakens a giant firebird and he destroys the forest they inhabit, to which the sprite must then go and bring her home back to life. For the finale, Roy knew that he wanted to cap the film off with something that had the same emotional power as the original's Night on Bald Mountain and Ave Maria segments. Finding the right piece to end the movie was a bit of a challenge, but then they discovered that they already had the rights to Firebird when Stravinsky himself gave Walt the license to some of his music for the original Fantasia, like Rite of Spring. The story of natural destruction and renewal came to Roy when he remembered going on a trip to Mount St. Helens and saw the devastation it caused not long after it erupted in 1980. He wondered what it would look like if there was a transition shot that spanned for a few hundred years to see the destruction being completely covered by nature reviving itself in the area, and thus came the premise of the segment, where it was given to the team in France led by Paul and Gaëtan Brizzy. Originally, the movie was meant to be released in 1997, but then it had to be pushed back by a few years in the year 2000. But not just in that year, but also directly when it would start on January 1st, 2000, making it the first ever feature film to be publicly released in the new millennium, along with giving the movie a new title from Fantasia Continued to Fantasia 2000. But a few weeks beforehand, on December 17, 1999, Disney started a tour where they premiered the movie before its public release that featured the film with a live orchestra, conducted by James Levine with the Philharmonia Orchestra, in a few renowned venues like Carnegie Hall in New York City, the Royal Albert Hall in London, the Théâtre des Champs-Élysées in Paris, the Orchard Hall in Tokyo, and the Pasadena Civic Auditorium in California. Also, on its 2000 release, Disney decided to first put it out exclusively in IMAX to take advantage of the enhanced cinematic experience it offered, and for marketing purposes to present it like a legitimate motion picture event, which also makes Fantasia 2000 the first ever animated feature presented in the IMAX format. However, as Disney was setting up the sequel just like the first film by presenting it as a great musical event and showing it in specifically made theaters, it also met the same fate as the original. The critics generally gave the film positive reviews, but in comparison to the first Fantasia, which was already accepted as one of Walt Disney's greatest masterpieces, 2000 felt like the inferior version. There were some segments that were agreed to be powerful with its blend of animation and choice of song, while others received a lot of mixed reactions, especially regarding some of its CGI and choice of narratives. Even with some of the criticisms though, it did receive 3 Annie Awards later on. But with its decision of heavily limiting the amount of screenings of the movie, it ended up costing the film massively at the box office, becoming Disney's first animated financial failure since The Rescuers Down Under. Sure, it broke some records in terms of IMAX films and did get a wide release a few months later on June 16th, but it only ended up making a total of just $60.7 million domestically and a worldwide total of $90.9 million on an $80 million budget. Following afterwards, there was a moment at Disney when they wanted to make another attempt of a Fantasia movie called Fantasia 2006. As work began in 2002, it would have been more similar to the Musicana concept, where the segments would tell stories from all around the world with music that could openly consider using those that also have lyrics to them. Among those segments that began production at the time were One by One, a deleted song from The Lion King written by Lebo M, directed by Peugeot Hunt, that presented children in South Africa getting together to fly kites. Then there was String Quartet No. 2 in D minor by Alexander Borodin that told the story of Hans Christian Andersen's The Little Match Girl, directed by Roger Allers. Then after that was Lorenzo, based on an old concept done by Joe Grant in 1949 that was revived by Mike Gabriel that showed a cat's tail having a mind of its own set to the music of Bordonio E900. And finally, there was Destino, another revived project that was originally conceived in the 1940s as a collaboration between Walt Disney and famed surreal artist Salvador Dali, brought back decades later at Disney's French studio led by Dominique Monferry, and put to the music of an original piece by Armando Dominguez and sung by Dora Luz. Ultimately, Fantasia 2006 was cancelled in 2004, and the segments that were in development for the project ended up becoming their own independent shorts, released individually at festivals and across several DVDs and Blu-rays of various Disney animated films. With the exception of One by One, each of the shorts earned a nomination at the Academy Awards. As a continuation of Fantasia, it is unfortunately appropriate that it initially got the same results as Fantasia, leaving Roy feeling exactly like Walt did 60 years prior. However, for that moment, it did succeed in fulfilling its artistic purpose, to keep the Fantasia legacy alive, using new technology in order to tell more timeless stories set to renowned classical music. It may generally be considered weaker than its predecessor, but it did help expand its legendary experiment with new segments, new music, and new ways to experience animation in a way that only Disney could conduct so beautifully. Even if Fantasia 2000 was a failure, it was possibly the most prominent proof that Disney was experimenting with animation throughout the 1990s, and always pushed the medium to the next level in order to continuously enhance their storytelling, especially with CGI. However, there was one film in development that took their experimentations even further than any other feature they were making at the time. In fact, Disney was creating their first fully computer-animated feature, or at least mostly computer-animated, with Dinosaur. The film presents Aladar, an iguanodon raised by lemurs whose home got entirely destroyed by a meteor shower. Soon afterwards, they come across a whole herd of dinosaurs that are migrating to a place called the Nesting Ground, where they could harmoniously live with all the food and water they need. Now as Aladar tries to blend in with the crowd, he and his lemur family do whatever they can to help those in need, survive from being hunted by two Carnotaurus, and have everyone make it to the Nesting Ground. It all started way back in 1986, when director Paul Verhoeven and visual effects supervisor Phil Tippett developed an idea to make a dinosaur movie while they were working on RoboCop. Soon after creating a script, along with some storyboards and a planned budget of $45 million, they pitched it to Disney to Jeffrey Katzenberg, to which he was ready to give a budget of $25 million. It was a hefty price to pay, but at least it was something that they could work with. And so in 1988, production began on their dinosaur project that would have been made like a Ray Harryhausen-style feature with stop-motion puppets and scaled models to present the time when dinosaurs roamed the Earth.
Walt Disney Pictures presents Dinosaurs! Dinosaurs!
In Verhoeven and Tippett's original version, the story had a darker tone and told in the style of a nature documentary, where a Styracosaurus named Woot and his little lemur friend named Suri try to survive and escape the wrath of a Tyrannosaurus Rex named Grozny.
Arrgh, it's feeding time. Prepare to die. Arrgh!
At the end, the two big dinos fight, with Woot being the winner, but it didn't really matter because the big asteroid came by anyways and made all the dinosaurs extinct.
Wait, what? Boom!
Leaving Suri and all the other lemurs as the only survivors.
Do 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 do.
After Paul and Phil ultimately left by 1990, the project went a bit in development hell. Some directors came and went, like Thomas G. Smith and David W. Allen tried their hands on the project and wanted to include a real lemur for the role of Suri. But the real downfall was when Jurassic Park came to the big screen and was a revolutionary success, leaving Disney to reevaluate what they were doing with their dino picture and put it on hold until they could try something similar to Jurassic and make their dinosaurs digitally. By 1994, Disney's animation division took their CG technology in order to try their hands on the project. For about 2 years, they experimented with the idea of making a fully computer-animated dinosaur feature, but with the CG backgrounds, it did not look as good as they'd hoped. But then, the team thought up of a crazy idea to solve their problems. Instead of fully making the backgrounds themselves, they would take live action footage and put their CG dinosaurs in the scenery. When they pitched it to Michael Eisner, it seemed like a big risk, especially when they had no idea how much it would cost. But Eisner trusted that they could get the job done and gave his approval to fully start the project. But on one condition. He demanded that most of the dinosaurs and the lemurs could talk in the movie. After some revisions, the updated version starred an iguanodon named Noah, who had the ability to see into the future and saw the asteroid that would make all the dinosaurs extinct. And it was up to him to save his herd alongside his grandparents and his lemur buddy Adam while facing two hungry Carnotaurus and a rival iguanodon named Cain. Later on, the story had to go through a few final changes to replace the names and remove the grandparents and the lead's future-seeing powers. Also, in order to accommodate Eisner's wish while having the dinosaurs look like they could believably speak, the iguanodons had to have their beaks replaced with lips. As for the directors, Disney hired Oliver and Company helmer George Scribner and storyboard artist Ralph Zondag. But not long after, George quit the project to work at Walt Disney Imagineering and was replaced by Eric Layton. To fully prepare to create their first major computer animated film, Disney bought the entire visual effects studio DreamQuest Images and blended it with their computer graphics unit into the Secret Lab. On a side note, the Secret Lab also served as its own visual effects studio and worked on several films like Armageddon and The Princess Diaries. However, the studio did not last long, and Disney shut its doors in 2001 for being too expensive to operate, and the last films they worked on were Reign of Fire and Kangaroo Jack. But back onto the movie. In order to achieve the blend of live-action environments with the computer-animated dinosaurs, the film crew first scouted at several locations like Venezuela, Australia, Hawaii, Florida, Western Samoa, Jordan, and Southern California, and took pictures of ideal spots to film. Then the animators created visual backgrounds in order to make their preliminary animation to establish their shots in the movie. Once that was done, the team went back to those locations to film the backgrounds and carrying the animations with them for reference as a 3D textbook so that the shots can match the visuals, along with doing some practical effects and create some photography techniques like the Dino Cam, where they put the camera on a cable between two towers in order to capture the perspective of a large roaming dinosaur. The shots were then returned to the animators where they finalized the animation and add some additional digital effects on top of blending the live action footage to make the scenery look bigger. At the same time, there were some elements that they had to cheat their way to capture the effect they wanted. Like the grass is actually the same texture of the fur from the lemurs, but painted green so that the computers can believably register when the dinosaurs interact with their environment. But out of all the scenes the crew had to work on, the hardest to technically pull off was the destruction of Lemur Island. On top of establishing some fast-moving action shots, the visual effects team had to think outside the box in order to replicate the meteor showers and make lots of explosions both digitally and on camera. They even had to create a small replica of Lemur Island so they could blow it up to present the grand scale of the devastation. For the music, on top of the score done by James Newton Howard, Lebo M returned to give the soundtrack some lyrics in the same way he did for The Lion King. And speaking of The Lion King, Disney decided to give the film a similar marketing technique by taking the opening scene and use it as its teaser trailer. Disney also decided to promote the picture in one of their parks by changing the name of the ride Countdown to Extinction in Disney's Animal Kingdom in Walt Disney World to Dinosaur, since it coincidentally also featured an iguanodon and a Carnotaurus as their leading dinos. And when the dinosaurs roamed the big screen on May 19th, 2000, it was as big of a hit as the giant lizards themselves. At least with the audience. The critics were not fans of the plot, calling it generic and too similar to Don Bluth's The Land Before Time, but still found that it was worth watching for the awe-inspiring visuals. But its success was most accredited at the box office, where it earned $137 million domestically and $348.8 million worldwide, making it the 5th highest grossing feature of the year. A few years later, in 2006, Disney made Dinosaur one of their first features to be released on Blu-ray discs, which also makes it the first animated film to be released on the format. More than most others, Disney took the opportunity with this film to be the most experimental they ever could be with their animation. So experimental that, to this day, many still often forget that this counts in the official Disney animation lineup. For some of its flaws that it carried, it still had some tremendous power with its animation and score to inspire audiences and bring them back millions of years ago to a whole new world. Something they never did since the original Fantasia. Its moment in the spotlight may have been short, but there was a moment when Dinosaur ruled the earth. In terms of released animated features, the year 2000 turned out to be Disney's busiest. Since they started the year off with Fantasia 2000, then it would only be fitting that they'd end the year off as well with another animated film, The Emperor's New Groove. It's about Cusco, the emperor of an Incan empire, who only cared about one thing and one thing only.
What's his name?
After firing his advisor Yzma, she and her assistant Kronk plot to murder Cusco to be the new emperor. But that didn't work out because a mix-up resulted Cusco to turn into a llama instead. Now paired up with a kind-hearted villager named Pacha, Cusco must get back to his kingdom to reclaim his throne and maybe learn along the way that not everything has to be about himself. When developing a movie, especially an animated feature, it's common to see that the final picture turned out to be dissimilar to the original concept. However, in the case of The Emperor's New Groove, it is one of the most famous examples of starting out as an entirely different film. Back in 1994, after he was done directing The Lion King, Roger Allers had an idea to make an epic feature based around Incan culture, and when he first pitched it to Michael Eisner, the CEO was more than happy to let him have full control to make the film thanks to his recent success with his last feature. The movie he envisioned was called Kingdom of the Sun, a Prince and the Pauper style story where a kind-hearted peasant named Pacha and a selfish emperor named Manco, whom both look identical, decided to swap places. But when the evil sorceress Yzma heard about the switch, she turned Manco into a llama and forces Pacha to do her bidding or else she would reveal his secret, since she plots to destroy the sun to regain her youth and beauty. But as the two fall in love with a girl in their respective new area, they now have to do whatever it takes to stop Yzma and turn Manco back into a human. Early on, Allers had almost everything ready to produce his next feature. He had a full story outlined, an Incan theme for the film's aesthetic and art style, a whole research trip in Machu Picchu, Randy Fulmer as the producer, Mark Dindal as a co-director, who was hired straight after directing Warner Brothers' Cats Don't Dance, a cast that included David Spade as Manco, Owen Wilson as Pacha, Eartha Kitt as Yzma, Laura Prepon and Carla Gugino as the love interests, Mata and Nina respectively, and Harvey Fierstein as Yzma's stone assistant, Hukua, and Sting to create several songs for the feature. Everything seemed like the team had everything in place to move forward with their next big animated musical, and for about 4 years, they managed to get a good amount finished, like Sting gave them some songs ready to go, and around a quarter of the animation was done. But there was just one problem.
Uh-oh.
Don't tell me. The executives hated almost everything about it.
Yep,
Gonna have to start back at the bottom?
most likely.
Bring it on. They may have gotten all the materials necessary to produce a potentially solid Disney film, but the heads at the studio found that what they had created was completely unengaging and unlikable with only very few elements that they actually enjoyed. And what was worse, now that the progress they've done was mostly all for naught, the team became heavily behind in their schedule, since the release was only a few years away. Allers thought that it would be an easy solution and asked to just delay the deadline so that they could fix all the story problems. However, Disney refused to move the release date, and knowing that his vision of the movie would never come to life, he ultimately quit the project. Meanwhile, Randy Fulmer and Mark Dindal, now the only director of the picture, were given a last chance to save the film by stopping the production for 6 months to create a better narrative, and the animators who were involved with Kingdom of the Sun moved to work on the Rhapsody in Blue segment for Fantasia 2000. Thanks to the help of storyboard artist Chris Williams and comedy writer David Reynolds, they managed to create a brand new story that is unlike anything what it originally started. There were a few elements that remained intact, like the Emperor turning into a llama and learning not to be selfish, the Incan theming, and David Spade and Eartha Kitt were still among the cast, but the film is now a buddy comedy in the style of a Chuck Jones cartoon that focused more on the Emperor than the peasant, and the title was later changed to The Emperor's New Groove. They also made significant changes to some of the characters, like Pacha is now a larger middle-aged man voiced by John Goodman, Yzma's assistant Hokua turned into a muscle-bound yet dim-witted guy named Kronk voiced by Patrick Warburton, and Monko's name was switched to Kuzco because they discovered that, in Japan, Monko would have been a fitting name for the character, but not really appropriate in front of the kids. But the biggest change from the revision was making the film a non-musical, meaning that they had to drop all the songs that Sting wrote for the picture. He was furious at first and wasn't a big fan of the new comedic edge the film was taking, but then cooled down a bit and stayed in the project, making a deal with Disney that 3 of the deleted songs would go in the movie's soundtrack, including Walk the Llama Llama, One Day She'll Love Me, and Snuff Out the Light. However, because he was working on a new album, he didn't have a lot of time to supply new songs and could only make 2 for the beginning and end, which are Perfect World, sung by Tom Jones, and My Funny Friend and Me. He was close to bailing out on the film entirely when he saw the ending where Kuzco built his Kuzcotopia theme park next to Pacha's home and invited the villagers' family to join in the fun. But the crew quickly switched it after getting Sting's letter regarding the issue and decided to finish off the film where now Kuzco is spending his vacation in a shack next to Pacha's house. But with the new changes to the feature, there were some sacrifices along the way, including Andreas Deja, who was originally animating Yzma, ended up losing interest after the new comedic take came in, and decided to move to the Florida studio to work on the feature that they were developing, and was replaced by Dale L. Bayer. As their time was limited and a lot of the budget was wasted on the previous version, Dindal's goal with the animation was to give it a simpler approach that emphasized less on presenting grand and complicated cinematic shots and crazy CG visual effects, and more on character animation to highlight their emotions and the comedy. They also received additional help to speed up production from the team in Florida and France. Originally, the film had been set for a long time to be released in the summer of 2000, but due to the time needed to completely rewrite the whole story, that release was given to Dinosaur and was moved several months later to December 15th. However, with that new release, it also came with a lot of trouble from an old former ally. Around the same time, Jeffrey Katzenberg had his own Mesoamerican themed animated comedy under his DreamWorks animation studio called The Road to El Dorado, and he was rushing his way to get his feature released before Disney's, and managed to do so by putting out his feature in March of that year. And this wasn't the first time that this happened either. There was a similar situation 2 years prior when DreamWorks and Pixar were feuding over Ants and A Bug's Life. But Disney wasn't in the mood of playing Jeffrey's rivalry games and still persisted with their December release, which only had a decent groove in theaters. The critics thought, while certainly not Disney's most ambitious or revolutionary work, it did provide some solid entertainment with its great cartoon-style comedy. But at the box office, Kuzco didn't receive a lot of riches, only making $89.3 million domestically and a global total of $169.3 million. The reason why the film wasn't so hot in theaters was due to the tough competition at the time, like Ron Howard's How the Grinch Stole Christmas, and Disney put their marketing focus a lot more on 102 Dalmatians. In a way, New Groove wasn't much of a hit, in fact it was closer to a flop, but on the bright side, it still did better than El Dorado. However, little did Disney knew that the groove would only get bigger and stronger as time moved on. When the film came out on home media, It was much more successful than when it was on the big screen, even becoming the highest-selling home media release of 2001, and had its name appear during awards season, like winning 3 Annies, and a nomination for an Oscar, a Golden Globe, and a Grammy for Best Song with My Funny Friend and Me. In 2005, Cusco's Kingdom grew bigger and became a franchise with a direct-to-video sequel called Kronk's New Groove, and an animated series called The Emperor's New School that ran for 2 seasons and 52 episodes. And even if the show wasn't highly well received, it did get a few awards of its own thanks to Eartha Kitt's performance as Yzma. And while it didn't have a ride to call its own, it was the visual inspiration for the Tokyo Disney Sea roller coaster Raging Spirits. Earlier in 2002, a documentary about the entire making of the feature was released at the Toronto International Film Festival called The Sweatbox, made by Sting's wife, Trudy Styler, which was part of the deal for Sting to be involved with the project in the first place. After screening at the festival, Disney never gave it any other release, nor was it shown to the public with the exception of a few leaks online. They never fully explain why they're hiding this one deep in the Disney vault, but if I have to take a guess, it's probably because the language might not be suitable for all audiences.
It's the feel of the
Well, why
music.
didn't you just f***ing say that in the first place?
Oh, that's too easy.
While some films find their success instantly, The Emperor's New Groove was one of those cases that it had to gradually find its audience. Nowadays, the movie is considered to be one of Disney's biggest fan favorites, with many still making memes out of the memorable scenes and quoting the variety of lines found in the film. While it certainly wasn't the first, nor will it be the last to have this happen, New Groove is one of the most prominent examples of how the final product and its legacy can be entirely unexpected and nothing like how the idea started. Throughout 2000, it was the year where Disney decided to take an entirely different direction than their previous works. They tried their version on Walt's most experimental project he ever put on film, they blended computer-animated dinosaurs with live-action backgrounds, and scaled down to produce a straightforward, fun-filled comedy. This theme of trying something new with their features continued in the following years, but in terms of their reception, let's just say that the worst was yet to come.
Speaking of which,